When 16-year-old Jamal and 15-year-old Leah walked through the streets of Liverpool, they were just like any other teenagers, school bags slung over their shoulders, plans for the weekend, dreams of a normal life. But behind closed doors, they were caught in a world most people didn't see, a hidden network that used young people to move drugs across the country. What started as small tasks quickly became a dangerous web of control, fear and exploitation, and Liverpool, a city known for its music and history, had become the epicenter of one of England's most ruthless county lines networks. This is the story of how an entire city was quietly transformed, and the young lives trapped at its center. Liverpool was a city of contrasts. Its streets carried echoes of a proud maritime history, bustling markets and vibrant music halls. Tourists flocked to see the waterfront, the iconic docks and the birthplace of one of the world's most famous bands. From the outside, it seemed like a city full of life, opportunity and culture. Yet beneath the surface there was another Liverpool, one that most residents preferred not to see. It was a city quietly being reshaped by forces few understood, and even fewer spoke about openly. In the beginning, it was almost imperceptible. Small groups of young men and teenagers began moving in patterns that seemed random but were anything but. Vans would appear in the dead of night, often parked in quiet streets near industrial estates or empty car parks. Packages were exchanged and transported with precision. At first, it looked like small-time smuggling or petty theft, easily dismissed as urban mischief, but the truth was far darker and far more organized. Liverpool, it turned out, was slowly becoming the epicenter of a sprawling criminal network known as county lines, a system in which drugs were sent from one city to smaller towns, controlled by gangs who exploited vulnerable youths as carriers. The appeal of Liverpool to these networks was clear. The city's layout made movement easy, with a mix of dense urban neighborhoods, quiet suburbs, and major transport links. The docks and industrial areas offered perfect cover for storage and distribution, while the tightly knit communities provided both camouflage and control. Outsiders could blend in, hiding in plain sight, while a hidden infrastructure quietly grew. Messages were encoded in simple words that seemed meaningless to outsiders, and numbers on walls or street corners often marked the locations of hidden packages. Everything was designed to operate under the radar, a well-oiled machine hidden in plain sight. Authorities were slow to catch on. Local police noticed some unusual activity: vans traveling long distances, spikes in reports of missing youths, and a rise in drug-related incidents, but the networks were difficult to trace. The young people involved often appeared to be acting independently, which made them seem less like criminals and more like troubled teens. Yet in reality, they were part of a system that exploited their vulnerability. Some were drawn by promises of fast money and flashy lifestyle. Others were coerced, threatened, and forced into compliance. These youths became both the lifeblood and the weak link of a network that stretched far beyond Liverpool, connecting the city to towns hundreds of miles away. The network's operations were both bold and meticulous. Vans moved silently through the streets at night, carrying drugs, waiting contacts in distant counties. Phones were swapped regularly to avoid detection, and coded messages were sent through social media platforms, seemingly innocent, but carrying vital instructions. Even warehouses, cafes, and unused flats were co-opted into the network. Ordinary people walked past these locations daily, completely unaware that their neighborhoods were being used as staging grounds for a sophisticated criminal empire. It was a system built on secrecy, fear, and opportunity. The city's culture and geography made it ideal for the gangs, but it also made the networks hard to dismantle. Liverpool's residents had no idea that the quiet streets they walked each day were the veins of a hidden criminal heart, pumping drugs, money, and control through the city and beyond. What seemed like random acts of petty crime were, in fact, carefully orchestrated movements in a much larger game, one in which the stakes were the safety, freedom, and lives of the city's most vulnerable youths. By the time the scale of the problem became apparent, the networks were already deeply embedded. Liverpool had transformed quietly but decisively into a hub, a central point from which county lines operations radiated across England. What had begun as small, almost invisible acts of crime had grown into a sprawling, highly organized system that would challenge police, families, and the city itself for years to come. The question that lingered over Liverpool was simple, yet terrifying. How could a city so vibrant and alive hide a secret so dark, and for so long? By 2016, what had started as small, almost invisible operations had grown into a sprawling, well-oiled network. Liverpool was no longer just a point of origin. It had become the heart of a system that stretched far beyond the city's limits. The term county lines began to appear in police briefings and news reports, but few outside law enforcement truly understood its meaning. For those on the inside, it was a ruthless and efficient method of moving drugs, money, and control across the country, and Liverpool was at its center. Young people, some barely in their teens, were the most prized assets of the gangs. They were recruited from schools, youth clubs, and even care homes. Some were lured with promises of fast money, flashy clothes, and respect. Others were coerced through threats, intimidation, and even violence. Once they became involved, leaving the network was almost impossible. They carried packages across counties, sometimes hundreds of miles from Liverpool, delivering drugs to towns that seemed worlds away from their own neighborhoods. The gangs relied on the fact that authorities often saw these youths as petty criminals rather than victims of organized crime. The scale and precision of the operations were staggering. The young carriers were given strict instructions, maps, and sometimes GPS devices to ensure that deliveries were made on time. Vans and cars were swapped regularly to avoid detection, and communications were encrypted or disguised as ordinary text messages and social media posts. To an outsider, it looked like a chaotic teenage adventure. To those inside the network, it was a life-or-death mission. One mistake, being late, losing a package, or contacting the wrong person could lead to punishment, often violent. Even more alarming was the way gangs exploited entire communities without leaving obvious traces. Houses in quiet suburbs became temporary safe houses, their occupants unaware of what was happening around them. Flats in apartment blocks were converted into storage hubs. Empty warehouses and backrooms in local businesses served as drop-off points. Ordinary people were walking past these locations every day, oblivious to the hidden operations taking place within. For the gangs, Liverpool's communities were not obstacles, they were camouflage. The city's dense streets and interconnected neighborhoods allowed them to move freely while remaining nearly invisible. The human cost of this system was devastating. Many of the youths involved suffered from fear, stress, and exploitation. Some were forced to live in abandoned houses, isolated from family and friends, under constant pressure to meet quotas. Others were sent alone on journeys to distant towns, carrying drugs with no protection or guidance. The psychological toll was immense, and yet the system perpetuated itself, feeding off vulnerability, poverty, and social neglect. As the networks expanded, a disturbing pattern emerged. Liverpool was not merely a hub, it was a training ground. Young recruits learned the ropes here before being sent further afield. The city's infrastructure, social systems, and even its culture were being manipulated to serve the gang's interests. Authorities began to notice clusters of missing youths and spikes in drug-related incidents, but connecting the dots took time. By the time patterns emerged, the network had already reached a level of sophistication that made it difficult to dismantle. Liverpool's transformation was both rapid and insidious. What once seemed like isolated acts of street crime had evolved into a sprawling, highly organized operation that threatened the safety and stability of the city. The gang's reliance on intimidation, coercion, and exploitation made them resilient, and their strategic use of technology and local geography made them nearly invisible. The quiet streets and familiar neighborhoods now hid a secret system of control, one that preyed on the young and vulnerable while silently expanding its reach. By the end of 2016, Liverpool had changed forever. The city was no longer just a backdrop for everyday life. It had become the central stage for a network that extended far beyond its borders. The county lines operations were no longer hidden in whispers. They were growing, evolving and challenging everyone who thought they understood the city. And for the young people caught in the system, there was no turning back. Liverpool had become both home and trap. A city of culture and opportunity shadowed by an underworld of control, fear, and ruthless ambition. As Liverpool's networks grew, it became clear that the operations were more than just street-level drug dealing. They were a shadow economy running parallel to the city's legitimate life. The gangs had learned that moving drugs was only half the battle. The other half was controlling the money, and they were surprisingly clever at it. Cash flowed through the city like an invisible river, hidden in plain sight, yet impossible for most outsiders to trace. Betting shops, small local businesses, and even community events became unsuspecting conduits for laundering vast sums of money. In some cases, festival stalls and charity events were used to funnel cash back into the network, a bold tactic that allowed gang leaders to remain untouchable. Technology became a critical tool. Encrypted messaging apps and burner phones ensured that instructions were transmitted safely and efficiently. The gangs also used online banking, cryptocurrency, and even gift cards to disguise transactions. Every method was calculated to avoid detection, leaving authorities with scattered leads that were often too small or disconnected to act on. What made the system even more terrifying was its adaptability. When one avenue was blocked by the police, another was quickly discovered and exploited. Liverpool had become a city running on two parallel systems, one public and visible, the other secret, organized and ruthless. The infiltration into legitimate spaces was subtle but extensive. Cafes, laundrettes and corner shops. Places residents visited daily without suspicion. Web of control and exploitation had taken hold. Authorities who tried to intervene often faced frustration. By the time patterns were noticed, the networks had shifted and evolved. Liverpool had become a testing ground for criminal innovation, a city where strategy, coercion and secrecy combined to create one of the most efficient county lines hubs in the country. By the time the network's reach was fully realized, Liverpool had transformed into a city of hidden transactions and invisible control. What once seemed like scattered incidents of youth crime had revealed itself as a sophisticated, resilient system, one that exploited people, technology, and communities alike. The city's culture, geography, and social structures were no longer just background. They were active tools in the gang's arsenal. Liverpool's hidden economy was thriving, and for everyone involved, there was no turning back. The tipping point came quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it would change everything. Authorities had long suspected that Liverpool's networks were extensive, but the full scale remained hidden. Then, during a months-long undercover operation, investigators began to see the city through the gang's eyes. What emerged was shocking. Liverpool was no longer merely a hub for local deliveries. It had become the command center for multiple county lines networks spanning the entire north of England. The streets, parks, and alleys that residents walked through daily were part of a sophisticated logistical system that moved drugs, money, and information with military precision. The investigation revealed methods that were both ingenious and chilling. Young people were sent on missions hundreds of miles from home, often alone, carrying packages that could ruin their lives if discovered. Vans, cars, and even bicycles were part of a rotation system, constantly swapped to avoid detection. Phones were encrypted and disposable. Contacts were carefully compartmentalized so that few ever knew the entire structure. Even community centers, cafes, and empty warehouses had been transformed into temporary hubs where drugs could be stored, sorted, and distributed without drawing attention. Every step of the operation was meticulously planned, yet almost invisible to outsiders. The psychological manipulation was as calculated as the logistics. Recruits were kept isolated, controlled, and under constant threat. Some were promised money, recognition, and a sense of belonging, while others were threatened with violence against themselves or their families. Investigators discovered that fear and loyalty were two sides of the same coin in the gang's strategy. Those who tried to escape were hunted down, sometimes violently, ensuring that compliance was almost total. The young people involved were both victims and unwilling enforcers, caught in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. The scale of the financial system was equally astonishing. Millions of pounds were moving through Liverpool each year, hidden in legitimate businesses, betting shops and small enterprises. Cryptocurrencies and online banking made tracking almost impossible. Even when police caught suspects, much of the money had already vanished into complex layers of transactions designed to cover the trail. The network was not just criminal, it was a self-sustaining, evolving machine, adapting constantly to law enforcement efforts. The investigation's revelations shocked the city. Liverpool, known for its music, history, and community spirit, was quietly hosting one of the most sophisticated county lines networks in the country. Families who had thought their streets were safe discovered that their neighborhoods had been used as staging grounds. Parents found out that care homes and youth clubs had been infiltrated. Ordinary streets had become arteries for a network whose reach extended far beyond the city. The hidden system was so extensive that even those involved often did not know the full picture. The arrests that followed were dramatic but only partially effective. Many young people were taken into custody, some for minor offenses, others for serious drug-related crimes. Yet as soon as one network was disrupted, another adapted to fill the gap. Liverpool's transformation was already too deep. The city's geography, social networks, and vulnerabilities had made it an ideal environment for county lines operations. The gangs had anticipated resistance, and their systems were resilient enough to survive initial blows. The tipping point revealed a harsh truth. Liverpool's county lines networks were not just a local problem, they were a national one. What began as small acts of exploitation and transportation had evolved into a city-wide infrastructure, quietly reshaping neighborhoods, communities, and the lives of countless youths. By exposing the scale of the operations, investigators had shown the world the city's hidden underworld, but dismantling it entirely would require more than arrests. It would require a complete rethink of how society, law enforcement and communities confronted the exploitation and control embedded in the system. Liverpool had changed forever. The city, that once seemed vibrant and safe, now had a shadow running through its streets, a reminder of how quickly organized crime could grow, adapt, and embed itself within everyday life. And while the investigation had uncovered much, one chilling question remained: how many others were still operating, unseen, waiting to step in wherever gaps appeared, ready to continue the cycle of control and exploitation? Even after the wave of arrests and media attention, Liverpool was far from free of the networks that had reshaped it. The county lines operations were resilient, and the gangs had already begun adapting, shifting routes, changing contacts, and finding new ways to exploit vulnerable youths. The city had seen the tip of the iceberg, but the underground machinery remained, hidden in the familiar streets, quiet neighborhoods, and abandoned buildings that had once been their cover. It became clear that stopping the networks would require more than police action. It would demand a coordinated social response. Authorities and community leaders began to realize that prevention was as critical as intervention. Schools and youth services were suddenly at the front line, tasked with identifying children at risk of recruitment. Outreach programs tried to reach those already involved, offering alternatives and support to escape the cycle of exploitation. Care homes, previously overlooked, were brought into focus. Staff were trained to spot warning signs, sudden changes in behavior, secretive phone use, unexplained absences, or new friends from outside the city. The battle against the networks became a race against time, with the city trying to intercept young people before they became fully trapped in the system. Former gang members became unexpected allies in this effort. Having lived through the manipulation, fear, and violence, they shared first-hand accounts of recruitment tactics, psychological pressure, and the realities of working within the networks. Their stories shocked families, schools, and authorities alike. It became evident that while the gang's strategies were sophisticated, the human cost was enormous. Teens who had once seemed confident and in control were revealed to be deeply traumatized, living under a constant threat they could neither name nor escape. The fight against county lines in Liverpool also exposed the wider social inequalities that had allowed the networks to thrive. Poverty, neglect, unstable family environments, and gaps in social services all contributed to the vulnerability of youths. The gangs exploited these weaknesses with ruthless efficiency. Understanding this systemic failure became a turning point in addressing the problem. Liverpool had to confront not only the criminals but also the societal conditions that allowed such a network to grow unchecked. Slowly, signs of change began to appear. Community awareness campaigns, strengthened youth services, and targeted police operations started to create pressure on the networks. Families learned to monitor their children, schools implemented early warning systems, and neighborhoods became more vigilant. Young people who had once been trapped in the cycle of delivery and fear were offered education, training and support to rebuild their lives. Yet even with these steps, it was clear that the networks were not gone. They had merely been forced to evolve. Liverpool's story became a cautionary tale for the rest of the country. It showed how quickly a city could transform from a place of opportunity into a hub for organized crime, simply through the combination of strategic location, social vulnerability, and criminal ingenuity. The networks had exploited both the geography and the society of the city, creating a system that seemed almost invisible until it reached a tipping point. By the end, Liverpool's fight was ongoing. The city had begun reclaiming its streets and its communities, but the shadows remained. The story of the county lines networks was a reminder that crime could grow silently, adapt relentlessly, and embed itself in places least expected. Liverpool had faced its hidden underworld and started to fight back, but the battle was far from over. The city's experience stood as both a warning and a lesson. Vigilance, community action, and understanding the human cost were the only tools capable of challenging a system built on fear, exploitation, and secrecy. Even as life in Liverpool continued, there was an uneasy awareness that the networks could return, and that the young people of the city, its most vulnerable residents, would always need protection, guidance and hope to keep the hidden machinery at bay. The city had learned the hard way that crime was not just an external threat. It could grow quietly within, hidden in plain sight, and only through awareness, resilience and community effort